October 17, 2023, east side of Cleveland, Ohio. A demolition crew was working on dismantling a massive 4-story brick factory that had stood at the corner of East 140th Street and Ashland Road since 1919. The morning was cold and overcast, temperatures hovering in the low 40s, with a light drizzle falling intermittently from the gray October sky. The old Cleveland Industrial Metalworks building had been abandoned for over 30 years, its windows shattered, its walls covered in graffiti, its interior filled with decades of accumulated debris. The crew had been working methodically through the structure for 3 weeks, stripping away the building's guts before the wrecking ball would arrive. Foreman David Kowalski, 53 years old, had supervised dozens of industrial demolitions across Northeast Ohio over his career. He had seen everything that old factories could hide: asbestos insulation, toxic chemicals, homeless encampments, illegal waste dumps, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for what his crew would find that morning in the building's basement level. The factory had been built during the height of Cleveland's industrial boom, when the city was the 5th largest in America, and its factories produced everything from automobile parts to steel machinery. The basement extended beneath the entire footprint of the building, nearly 40,000 square feet of concrete floor and brick columns stretching into darkness. The crew had been clearing debris from the basement's northwest corner when excavator operator Michael Dombrowski noticed something unusual beneath a section of concrete floor. The concrete in this area looked different from the surrounding floor: newer, smoother, poured in a rectangular pattern, approximately 12 feet long and 8 feet wide. Dombrowski had been operating heavy equipment for 22 years, and he recognized the telltale signs of a patch job. He called over Foreman Kowalski to take a look. The two men studied the concrete carefully, noting how its color differed slightly from the original floor, how its surface was smoother and showed less wear than the century-old concrete surrounding it. Kowalski made the decision to investigate further rather than simply proceed with demolition. Using a jackhammer, Dombrowski began breaking through the newer concrete. The patch was approximately 6 inches thick, significantly thicker than necessary for a simple floor repair. After 20 minutes of work, the jackhammer broke through into a void beneath the concrete surface. Dombrowski stopped immediately and stepped back from the opening. Through the hole, he could see darkness below a hidden chamber that had been sealed beneath the factory floor. The air that escaped from the opening was stale and cold, carrying a faint chemical odor that neither man could identify. Kowalski retrieved a flashlight from the equipment truck. What the flashlight beam revealed made both men step back involuntarily. Below the concrete, in a chamber approximately 4 feet deep, sat what appeared to be a vintage motorcycle covered in a thick layer of dust and debris. The machine was unmistakably old, its curved fenders and bulbous fuel tank suggesting a design from the 1942 or earlier. But it was what lay beside the motorcycle that caused Kowalski to immediately order his crew to stop all work and step away from the area. Slumped against the chamber's brick wall, still partially dressed in the rotted fragments of what had once been clothing, were human skeletal remains. Whoever had been buried here had been entombed alongside their motorcycle decades ago. The remains were positioned deliberately, not simply dumped. The skeleton sat with its back against the chamber's brick wall, legs extended toward the motorcycle as if its owner were resting beside his prized machine. Fragments of dark fabric, what had once been a suit jacket, still clung to the shoulder bones. The skull faced forward, eye sockets dark and empty, jaw slightly open. Kowalski, a veteran of difficult demolition sites, felt his stomach turn. He immediately recognized the significance of what they had found. This was not a random burial or an accident. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to create this secret tomb beneath a working factory floor. Kowalski called 911 at 9:47 de la mañana. The first Cleveland police units arrived within 15 minutes, followed by detectives from the homicide unit shortly after. By noon, the basement had been transformed into an active crime scene, with yellow tape cordoning off the entire northwest section and portable lights illuminating the sealed chamber. Crime scene technicians began the delicate process of documenting everything before any evidence could be removed. The motorcycle, they could now see clearly, was an Indian Scout, one of the most iconic American motorcycles ever produced. Its distinctive maroon and cream paint scheme was still visible beneath 6 decades of accumulated dust and grime. Dr. Sarah Chen, the Cuyahoga County medical examiner, arrived at the scene shortly after 1 o'clock in the afternoon. She had been called personally by the lead detective after investigators realized they were dealing with a historical case that would require special handling. Dr. Chen supervised the careful excavation of the human remains, which were remarkably well preserved due to the sealed environment of the chamber. The skeleton was complete, lying in a position that suggested the victim had been placed there deliberately rather than simply dumped. Personal effects found with the remains included a gold wristwatch still encircling the left wrist bone, a wallet in the jacket's inner pocket, and a distinctive gold ring on the right hand's ring finger. The wallet contained a New York driver's license that had been issued in 1961, along with several business cards and approximately $300 in cash, a significant sum in 1963. But it was the name on the license that immediately caught the attention of investigators familiar with Cleveland's organized crime history. The identification belonged to Anthony Michael Carbone, a name that appeared in FBI files from the 1962 as a known associate of the Cleveland crime family. Carbone had been reported missing in October 1963, and despite an extensive investigation at the time, no trace of him had ever been found. Now, 60 years later, his final resting place had been discovered in a sealed chamber beneath a Cleveland factory floor. News of the discovery spread quickly through Cleveland's law enforcement community. The FBI's Cleveland field office dispatched agents to the scene to coordinate with local investigators. Historical crime records were pulled from archives, and retired agents who had worked organized crime cases in the 1962 were contacted for background information. The Cleveland crime family, also known as the Mayfield Road Mob, after the Little Italy neighborhood where its leaders gathered, had been one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the Midwest during the mid-20th century. Under boss John Scalish, who led the family from 1945 until his death in 1976, the Cleveland mob had controlled gambling, loan sharking, and labor rackets throughout northern Ohio. The factory where Carbone had been found had been owned during the 1962 by a company with documented connections to organized crime figures. Cleveland Industrial Metalworks had manufactured automobile parts and industrial machinery, employing over 500 workers at its peak. But investigators in the 1962 had suspected the company was also used to launder money from the mob's gambling operations and to provide legitimate employment records for crime family associates. The building's location in the heavily industrial Collinwood neighborhood, with its maze of factories and rail yards, had made it an ideal location for activities that required privacy and discretion away from prying eyes. The Collinwood neighborhood had been one of the heaviest industrial areas in the world during the mid-20th century. Within its boundaries stood Fisher Body Division of General Motors, Thompson Products, General Electric, Lincoln Electric, Eaton Axle, National Acme, Bailey Meter, and dozens of other manufacturing operations. The New York Central Railroad yards provided transportation links that moved raw materials in and finished products out. The surrounding residential streets housed the workers who manned the factories around the clock. It was a world of smokestacks and assembly lines, of lunch pails and union cards, of prosperity built on American manufacturing might. By 1963, this world was already beginning to change. But the factories still ran 3 shifts. As technicians continued to process the crime scene over the following days, the full scope of what had happened in October 1963 began to emerge. The chamber had been professionally constructed, its brick walls matching the factory's original construction perfectly in both material and bonding pattern. The concrete seal had been poured with care, designed to be indistinguishable from routine maintenance work. Whoever had created this tomb had access to construction materials and the skills to use them, or they had employed workers who did. The level of sophistication suggested this was not a spontaneous killing, but a carefully planned execution and concealment operation that had required significant resources and coordination. The Indian Scout motorcycle provided crucial evidence for establishing the timeline of Carbone's death. The motorcycle was a 1941 Indian Sports Scout, equipped with the classic 45 cubic-inch side-valve V-twin engine that had made the Scout famous among American riders. The machine was painted in Indian's distinctive maroon and cream color scheme, with chrome accents that still gleamed faintly beneath the accumulated dust. According to FBI records from 1963, Carbone had been known to ride a vintage Indian motorcycle, one of only a handful remaining in operational condition, in the Cleveland area at that time. The distinctive motorcycle had made him easily identifiable to anyone who knew him. The motorcycle's odometer showed 23,847 miles, frozen at the moment Carbone had taken his final ride. The fuel tank still contained traces of gasoline that had long since evaporated into residue. The keys were still in the ignition, suggesting that whoever had killed Carbone had simply rolled the motorcycle into the chamber alongside his body rather than disposing of it separately. This detail struck investigators as significant. The motorcycle was valuable, both monetarily and as potential evidence, yet the killers had chosen to bury it rather than remove it. This suggested either extreme caution about being seen with the distinctive vehicle or a desire to make Carbone and his beloved Indian Scout disappear completely and permanently from the face of the earth. Dr. Chen's preliminary examination of the skeletal remains revealed evidence of trauma consistent with homicide. 2 distinct gunshot wounds were visible in the skull, one at the base of the occipital bone, the other slightly higher on the right parietal. The trajectory of the wounds suggested that Carbone had been shot from behind while seated or kneeling, the classic execution-style killing that was the signature of organized crime hits during that era. No bullet fragments were recovered from the chamber, indicating that the projectiles had passed completely through the skull, consistent with large-caliber ammunition fired at close range. The killer had wanted to make absolutely certain that Carbone was dead. The condition of Carbone's clothing provided additional forensic details about his final moments. He had been wearing a dark wool suit, now deteriorated but still recognizable in its fragments, along with what had been a white dress shirt and silk tie. His shoes were expensive, Italian leather, custom-made, the kind worn by men of status and means in that era. This was not the attire of a factory worker or manual laborer. Carbone had been dressed for business when he died. The gold watch on his wrist was a Rolex Datejust, purchased new in 1962, according to serial number records that still existed. Together with the $300 in his wallet and the gold ring on his finger, the evidence clearly suggested that robbery had not been the motive for his murder. Historical records from 1963 painted a picture of a man at the height of his criminal career who had suddenly vanished. Anthony Michael Carbone had been a rising figure in the Cleveland underworld, a trusted associate of boss John Scalish, who handled sensitive assignments requiring intelligence and discretion. Born in Brooklyn in 1923, Carbone had relocated to Cleveland in 1952 after establishing himself in New York's gambling operations. He was 40 years old when he disappeared, married with 2 children, living in a comfortable house in the suburb of Garfield Heights. His legitimate employment was listed as a consultant for Cleveland Industrial Metalworks, the very factory where his body would be discovered 60 years later, beneath the basement floor. Before we continue with this investigation, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. What happened in October 1963 involves Cleveland's powerful organized crime family, a trusted associate who knew too many secrets, and a disappearance that remained unsolved for 6 decades. The questions investigators faced were both fascinating and grim. Who ordered the execution of Anthony Carbone? Why was he killed, alongside his priced Indian Scout motorcycle? And how did professional killers manage to entomb a man and his machine beneath a working factory floor without anyone noticing? By the end of this story, you will understand the truth that remained buried for 60 years beneath the concrete of Cleveland Industrial Metalworks. Anthony Michael Carbone was 40 years old in October 1963, a compact but powerfully built man who stood 5 feet 9 inches tall and weighed approximately 175 pounds. His hair was black, slicked back in the style of the era, his eyes dark brown, his complexion olive from his Sicilian heritage. Those who knew him described a man of contradictions, charming and personable in social situations, but capable of sudden coldness when business required it. He favored well-tailored suits from Cleveland's best clothiers, Italian leather shoes, and silk ties, always presenting himself as a successful businessman, rather than what he actually was. A skilled criminal operative who had risen through the ranks, through intelligence, loyalty, and an absolute willingness to do whatever was necessary. Born in Brooklyn's Red Hook neighborhood on El 15 de Marzo de 1923, Carbone had grown up in the shadow of organized crime during the Depression era. His father, Salvatore Carbone, had worked as a longshoreman on the Brooklyn waterfront, a job controlled by organized crime through the International Longshoremen's Association. Young Anthony had learned early that survival in his neighborhood required understanding who held power and how to navigate their demands. By his late teens, he was running numbers for local bookmakers, collecting small debts, and proving himself reliable to men who valued reliability above all other qualities. His intelligence caught the attention of mid-level crime figures who saw potential in the young man from Red Hook. During World War II, Carbone served in the United States Army, stationed first in North Africa and later in Italy during the Allied campaign. His service record was unremarkable. He never saw direct combat and served primarily in supply and logistics, but the experience exposed him to a wider world and taught him skills that would prove valuable in his criminal career. He became fluent in Italian, learned to navigate bureaucratic systems and military hierarchies, and developed connections with Italian nationals who would later prove useful. When he returned to Brooklyn in 1946, he was no longer the teenage numbers runner, but a mature man of 23, ready to take on more significant responsibilities in the organization. The late 1942 and early 1952 saw Carbone rise steadily through New York's gambling operations in Brooklyn and Queens. He managed bookmaking operations for mid-level figures, served as an intermediary between street-level operators and the families who controlled the territory, and developed a reputation for two essential qualities. He was scrupulously honest in his accounting, never skimming or cheating his superiors even when opportunities presented themselves. And he was absolutely discreet, never revealing information even under pressure from law enforcement. These qualities made him valuable to his superiors, but they also made him potentially dangerous, a man who knew too much about too many operations and kept everything locked inside his head. The move to Cleveland in 1952 was presented as a promotion, an opportunity to help the Cleveland family under John Scalish manage their expanding gambling interests in the Midwest. In reality, certain New York figures wanted Carbone far from Manhattan, where FBI agents were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about gambling operations he had supervised. Cleveland offered a fresh start, a new city where he was unknown to law enforcement, new opportunities to prove his value, and new bosses who cared nothing about old secrets from the eastern seaboard. Carbone accepted the transfer graciously, understanding the implied message. He packed his belongings, including his beloved 1941 Indian Scout motorcycle, and drove west to his new home. John Scalish, the Cleveland boss, recognized Carbone's abilities immediately and put them to use. Scalish was a careful, methodical leader who preferred stability to violence and business to bloodshed. He had taken control of the Cleveland family in 1944 after his predecessor Alfred Palisi retired to Florida, and he would rule it for 32 years, the longest tenure of any Cleveland mob boss. Under Scalish, the family had developed lucrative partnerships with legitimate businesses, established profitable relationships with crime families in other cities, and built extensive connections to the Las Vegas casino industry through associates like Mo Dalitz. Scalish needed intelligent, reliable men to manage these complex relationships. Within months of arriving in Cleveland, Carbone had become one of Scalish's most trusted associates, handling assignments that required both intelligence and absolute discretion. His primary responsibility was managing gambling operations in Youngstown, Ohio, a steel town approximately 70 miles southeast of Cleveland. Youngstown had long been contested territory, claimed by both Cleveland and Pittsburgh crime families, and the boundaries between their operations required constant enforcement and negotiation. Carbone served as Cleveland's representative in the region, collecting payments from local numbers operators, resolving disputes between competing bookmakers, and ensuring that the delicate peace between Cleveland and Pittsburgh was maintained through diplomacy and the implicit threat of violence. Carbone's success in Youngstown elevated his status within the Cleveland organization considerably over the following years. He attended meetings at the social clubs on Mayfield Road in Little Italy, where the family's leadership gathered to discuss business. He was welcomed into the circle of trusted advisors who counseled Scalish on important decisions affecting the family's interests. He earned well from his percentage of Youngstown's gambling revenues, enough to buy a comfortable house in Garfield Heights, to drive a new Cadillac for business purposes, and to maintain his beloved Indian Scout motorcycle in perfect mechanical condition. By the early 1962, Carbone had established himself as a respected figure in Cleveland's underworld hierarchy. The 1941 Indian Sport Scout was his pride, a machine he had purchased in New York in 1949 and had maintained meticulously over the 14 years since. The Scout had been manufactured just before America entered World War II, one of the last of the original Scout line before Indian abandoned the model in favor of newer designs. Its 45 cubic inch V-twin engine produced approximately 30 horsepower, enough to propel the lightweight machine to speeds that thrilled its rider on the open road. Carbone was known to ride the Scout on Sunday mornings through the Cleveland metro parks, enjoying the freedom and speed that the powerful engine provided. Among his fellow criminals, the Indian Scout was as much a part of his identity as his tailored suits and Italian shoes. His family life appeared stable on the surface, a picture of Italian-American prosperity in suburban Cleveland. Maria Carbone, née Falcone, was the daughter of a Cleveland businessman with his own connections to the local Italian community. They had married in 1954, shortly after Carbone's arrival in Cleveland, and had two children, Anthony Jr., born in 1955, and Lucia, born in 1958. Maria understood what her husband did for a living, as did most wives of organized crime figures in that era, but she did not ask questions and did not interfere with his business affairs. The children attended Catholic school. The family attended Mass on Sundays at Holy Rosary Church in Little Italy, and to outside observers, the Carbones appeared to be a prosperous family living the American dream. But beneath this surface of domestic normalcy, tensions were building that would ultimately cost Anthony Carbone his life. The arrangement between Cleveland and Pittsburgh over Youngstown had begun to fray by 1960. Those younger members of both organizations were restless, eager to expand their operations and increase their profits beyond what the current agreements allowed. Pittsburgh figures began pressuring Youngstown operators to pay higher tribute, challenging the existing boundaries that Carbone was responsible for maintaining. He found himself caught between his loyalty to Cleveland and the growing demands from Pittsburgh for a larger share of Youngstown's gambling revenues. Carbone reported his concerns to Scalish directly, warning that the situation in Youngstown was becoming increasingly dangerous and that conflict might be unavoidable without some accommodation. But Scalish, ever cautious, ever preferring negotiation to confrontation, instructed Carbone to maintain the status quo, rather than risk open conflict with Pittsburgh. This placed Carbone in an impossible position. Pittsburgh figures interpreted his continued enforcement of existing boundaries as personal opposition rather than following orders. Meanwhile, Some Cleveland figures began to wonder whether Carbone was secretly negotiating with Pittsburgh, using his position as intermediary to advance his own interests at the family's expense. The final months of Carbone's life were marked by increasing isolation from both his criminal associates and his family. He attended fewer meetings in Cleveland's Little Italy, spent more time in Youngstown managing day-to-day operations, and grew distant from Maria and the children at home. Maria would later tell investigators that her husband had seemed preoccupied in the weeks before his disappearance, that he had stopped riding his beloved motorcycle on Sunday mornings and had begun carrying a pistol at all times, behaviors that were unusual even for a man in his line of work. He had never explained what was troubling him, and she had known better than to ask questions. By October 1963, Anthony Carbone had become a liability to multiple parties. He knew too much about the Cleveland family's operations in Youngstown and had become a focal point for both FBI surveillance and Pittsburgh pressure. Pittsburgh wanted him removed as an obstacle to their expansion. Some Cleveland figures suspected him of disloyalty. The FBI saw him as a potential witness who might someday be turned against the organization. Carbone himself seemed to sense the danger closing in around him. He began varying his routines, taking different routes to Youngstown, meeting associates in different locations. But in the end, there was nowhere to hide from men who had decided he needed to disappear. On Saturday, October 19, 1963, Anthony Carbone left his Garfield Heights home at approximately 7:30 pulgada the evening, telling his wife he had a business meeting downtown and would return before midnight. He was driving his 1963 Cadillac DeVille, dressed in a dark wool suit and carrying his 38 revolver in a shoulder holster beneath his jacket. His Indian Scout motorcycle remained in the garage, or so Maria believed. What she did not know was that Carbone had arranged for someone to pick up the motorcycle earlier that day, ostensibly for maintenance at a shop in the city. In retrospect, this suggested that Carbone knew something about what was coming. He kissed Maria goodbye at the door, paused to look at his sleeping children in their beds, and walked out into the October evening. The weather was cool, temperatures in the mid-50s, with clear skies and a waning moon. Carbone backed the Cadillac out of the driveway, waved once to Maria watching from the window, and drove away into the darkness. He headed north toward the city, toward Little Italy, toward whatever fate awaited him at his business meeting. It was the last time Maria Carbone would ever see her husband alive. 60 years would pass before anyone would learn what happened next. The next morning, Sunday, October 20, 1963, Carbone's Cadillac was found in the parking lot of a restaurant on Mayfield Road in Little Italy, approximately 2 blocks from the social clubs where the Cleveland crime family's leadership gathered. The car was locked, the keys missing, with no signs of struggle or violence inside the vehicle. The restaurant's owner, who had known Carbone for years, told police that he had not seen Carbone that evening and had no idea why his car would have been left in the parking lot. The Indian Scout motorcycle was nowhere to be found. Anthony Carbone had vanished completely, and the wall of silence that protected organized crime figures descended immediately over anyone who might have known what happened. Maria Carbone waited until Tuesday, October 22, to report her husband missing, hoping each hour that he would return, or at least contact her, with an explanation for his absence. When she finally called the Cleveland police, detectives responded to the Garfield Heights home and took her statement. She described her husband as a business consultant, declined to elaborate on the nature of his business, and insisted that he had no enemies who might wish him harm. The detectives recognized the evasions immediately. They had interviewed enough mob wives to know the pattern. They also recognized the name Carbone from intelligence files and understood that this disappearance was almost certainly connected to organized crime activity. But understanding and proving were two different things entirely. The FBI opened its own investigation within 72 hours of Carbone's disappearance being reported to Cleveland police. Federal agents had been monitoring the Cleveland family closely since the Appalachian meeting of November 1957, when a raid on a gathering of top mob bosses in upstate New York had exposed the nationwide scope of organized crime to public view. John Scalish had attended that meeting, and his presence had confirmed what federal investigators had long suspected: that the Cleveland family was a significant power in the national criminal hierarchy. The disappearance of one of Scalish's trusted associates was exactly the kind of internal conflict that might weaken the organization and provide opportunities for federal prosecution. Federal agents pursued multiple investigative threads simultaneously in the weeks that followed Carbone's disappearance. They placed wiretaps on known associates, conducted extensive surveillance of crime family meeting places, and interviewed anyone who might have information about Carbone's fate. They examined his financial records, traced his movements in the days before his disappearance, and developed profiles of potential suspects within both the Cleveland and Pittsburgh organizations. But the investigation quickly hit walls at every turn. Witnesses claimed to know nothing. Surveillance revealed nothing unusual. And the wiretaps, while providing valuable intelligence about other criminal activities, captured no discussions about what had happened to the man they called the motorcycle man. The investigation focused particularly on the territorial dispute in Youngstown that had dominated the final months of Carbone's life. FBI agents developed two primary theories about what had happened. The first held that Pittsburgh operatives had eliminated Carbone to remove Cleveland's most effective representative in the region, clearing the way for Pittsburgh's expansion into Youngstown's gambling operations. The second theory suggested that Cleveland's own leadership had ordered Carbone's death, suspecting him of secretly negotiating with Pittsburgh, or perhaps fearing that he might cooperate with the FBI's ongoing investigation. Both theories had supporting evidence, but neither could be proven without witnesses or physical evidence. John Scalish was interviewed twice by FBI agents in the weeks following Carbone's disappearance. Both times, the veteran mob boss denied any knowledge of what had happened to his associate. He expressed concern for Carbone's welfare, suggested that perhaps he had fled Cleveland to avoid some personal difficulty, and politely declined to speculate about who might have wished him harm. Scalish was an experienced subject of law enforcement investigation and gave the agents nothing useful. He had survived 30 years in organized crime by knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. The disappearance of Anthony Carbone was clearly a matter that called for silence. The lack of a body frustrated investigators attempting to build any kind of case. Without physical evidence of murder, they could not prove that Carbone was dead rather than simply in hiding somewhere. Without knowing where or how he had been killed, they could not develop forensic evidence linking suspects to the crime. Without the Indian Scout motorcycle, they could not even prove that he had come to harm rather than simply driven away on his beloved machine to start a new life elsewhere. The FBI interviewed dozens of people connected to both the Cleveland and Pittsburgh organizations, but the wall of omerta, the code of silence, held firm against every approach. By the spring of 1965, the FBI had effectively closed its active investigation into Carbone's disappearance. The case file ran to over 300 pages of interviews, surveillance reports, and analysis. But it concluded with a simple assessment. Subject is presumed deceased, probably victim of organized crime homicide. No prosecution recommended due to lack of evidence and witnesses. The case was classified as cold. And Anthony Michael Carbone was presumed dead, though his body had never been found, and his fate remained officially unknown. Maria Carbone eventually had him declared legally dead in 1971, 8 years after his disappearance, allowing her to access his life insurance policies and begin formally rebuilding her life without him. The decades that followed brought enormous changes to Cleveland and its organized crime landscape, changes that would have been unimaginable in October 1963. John Scalish continued to run the Cleveland family with his characteristic caution, avoiding the violence that plagued other organizations and focusing on the steady income from gambling, loan sharking, and the Las Vegas casino skimming operations that he had helped establish. But Scalish made one critical mistake during his long reign. He refused to induct new members into the family, preferring to keep profits concentrated among a shrinking circle of aging associates. By the mid-1972, the Cleveland family had fewer than 30 made members, most of them elderly. John Scalish died during open-heart surgery in May 1976, and his death triggered a violent power struggle that would devastate the organization he had led for over 3 decades. James Jack White Licavoli, a veteran mob figure with ties to Detroit's Purple Gang, took control after Scalish's death. But Licavoli faced immediate challenges from Irish gangster Danny Green and rogue Teamster leader John Nardi, who had formed an alliance to seize control of Cleveland's rackets. Green was a fearless and charismatic figure who had no respect for the traditional rules of organized crime and no hesitation about using violence against Italian mob figures who had dominated Cleveland's underworld for W10-1 Proci in Nevertine. The ensuing mob war saw nearly 40 car bombings in Cleveland during 1976 and 1977, earning the city the nickname Bomb City, USA, in national media coverage. Green and Nardi struck first, killing several of Licavoli's key associates, including his underboss, Leo Mosseri, whose body was never found. Licavoli's forces struck back, killing Nardi in a car bombing in May 1977. The violence reached its climax on October 6, 1977, exactly 14 years after Anthony Carbone's disappearance, when Danny Green was killed by a car bomb outside a dentist's office in the suburb of Lyndhurst. His death ended the immediate conflict but brought intense federal scrutiny to Cleveland's organized crime operations. The aftermath of the mob war proved even more devastating to the Cleveland family than the violence itself. James Licavoli was convicted of conspiracy in Danny Green's murder and sentenced to 17 years in federal prison. He died behind bars in 1985. Angelo Leonardo, who had served as underboss under Licavoli, faced his own federal charges and made a decision that would have been unthinkable to men like John Scalish. He became a government witness. In 1983, Leonardo became the highest-ranking Mafia member ever to cooperate with federal authorities, providing testimony that helped convict mob figures across the country and effectively destroyed what remained of the Cleveland family's power and influence. While the Cleveland mob was consuming itself in violence and betrayal, the factory where Anthony Carbone lay buried continued operating on East 140th Street in Collinwood. Cleveland Industrial Metalworks produced automotive parts through the 1972, its workers walking daily above the sealed chamber where Carbone and his motorcycle lay entombed in darkness. None of them knew what was beneath their feet. The concrete seal had been poured so expertly that it had never cracked, never shifted, never drawn attention during routine maintenance or inspections. The secret remained buried, while the world above it changed beyond recognition. But the decline of American manufacturing eventually caught up with Cleveland Industrial Metalworks, just as it caught up with thousands of other factories across the industrial Midwest. Competition from foreign manufacturers, automation that reduced labor needs, and the general economic decline of the region all took their toll. By 1985, the workforce had shrunk from over 500 to fewer than 100 employees. The company struggled through the rest of the decade, cutting costs and reducing operations, before finally closing its doors permanently in 1989. The factory that had concealed a murder for 26 years fell silent, joining the growing ranks of abandoned industrial buildings across Cleveland. The neighborhood around the factory changed even more dramatically over the following decades. The rail yards that had once employed thousands fell silent as freight traffic shifted to highways. The Fisher Body Plant, which had been one of the largest employers in Collinwood, closed in 1980. With over 1,000 workers losing their jobs. Other factories followed the same path: General Electric, Eaton, National, Acme, each closure, leaving another abandoned building and hundreds more unemployed workers. Collingwood's population declined as families moved to the suburbs or to other cities entirely. seeking opportunities that no longer existed in Cleveland's industrial neighborhoods. The Cleveland Industrial Metalworks building began its slow decay after the 1989 closure. Homeless people moved in, seeking shelter from Cleveland's brutal winters and setting fires for warmth that left smoke stains on the walls and ceilings. Vandals broke windows and spray-painted graffiti on every available surface, turning the factory into a canvas of urban decay. Scrappers stripped anything of value, copper wiring, metal fixtures, sections of the roof, leaving the building increasingly exposed to the elements. Each winter brought more damage as water infiltrated the structure and froze, cracking concrete and crumbling brickwork that had stood solid for decades. Environmental investigators discovered asbestos throughout the structure during an assessment in the early 2002, along with petroleum contamination in the soil from decades of industrial operations. The building was added to a growing list of contaminated industrial sites awaiting remediation, a problem too expensive for the city of Cleveland to address alone. Estimates for demolition and cleanup ran into the millions of dollars money that a shrinking city with a declining tax base simply did not have. The factory continued to rot, while officials searched for funding sources, and the sealed chamber in the basement remained undisturbed. The city of Cleveland finally took ownership of the property through tax foreclosure proceedings in 2018, adding it to an inventory of thousands of abandoned and tax-delinquent properties that had accumulated over decades of population loss and economic decline. But owning the property did not solve the problem of what to do with it. The building sat vacant for another 5 years, while city officials pursued state and federal funding for demolition and environmental remediation. Grant applications were submitted, rejected, revised, and resubmitted. Budget cycles came and went. And all the while, Anthony Carbone and his Indian Scout motorcycle lay undisturbed in their brick-walled tomb beneath the crumbling factory. Maria Carbone had remarried in 1975, 4 years after having her missing husband declared legally dead, and built a new life far from the world of organized crime. She moved to a smaller house in another suburb, raised her children to completion, and found happiness with a new husband who had nothing to do with gambling or the mob. She rarely spoke of Anthony Carbone, even to her children, and when they asked about their father, she gave only vague answers about him being gone and not coming back. She passed away in Doe's Mill, once at the age of 82, never knowing what had happened to the husband who had kissed her goodbye one October evening and vanished forever. Anthony Carbone Jr. had followed a deliberately legitimate path after his father's disappearance, perhaps consciously rejecting the world that had consumed his father. He earned a degree in accounting, married a woman from outside the Italian community, and raised his own family in the suburbs far from Little Italy and Mayfield Road. He worked for a respectable firm, paid his taxes, attended church, and lived the kind of ordinary American life that his father had only pretended to live. But he never stopped wondering what had happened on that October night in 1963. He was 68 years old when his mother died, 78 when investigators finally called with news about his father's remains. Lucia Carbone, the younger child, had been only 5 years old when her father disappeared, too young to have clear memories of him. She knew him mainly through photographs and her mother's reluctant recollections, a shadowy figure who had existed and then simply stopped existing without explanation. She moved to California after college and built a life 3,000 miles from Cleveland, from Little Italy, from everything associated with her father's world. She rarely spoke of him even to close friends and had long since stopped wondering about his fate. The past, she had decided, was better left buried. But the past, it turned out, had other plans. Finally, in 2023, a combination of American Rescue Plan Act funds and state brownfield remediation grants provided the resources needed to address the Cleveland Industrial Metalworks site. Demolition contracts were awarded, environmental assessments were completed, and in September, 2023, crews began the process of dismantling the structure that had stood on East 140th Street for over a century. Foreman David Kowalski and his team had no idea they were about to uncover one of Cleveland's oldest unsolved organized crime mysteries. They were simply doing their job, clearing away the remnants of the city's industrial past to make way for whatever future might come. What they found in that basement would change everything. The forensic investigation of the sealed chamber continued for several weeks after its discovery in October 2023, employing techniques that had not existed when Anthony Carbone disappeared in 1963. Soil samples, construction materials, and trace evidence were all analyzed using modern forensic methods. DNA extracted from the skeletal remains was compared against reference samples provided by the surviving children, confirming the identification that had been suggested by the wallet and identification cards found with the body. The motorcycle was carefully extracted from the chamber and transported to a secure facility where automotive historians and FBI analysts examined it together, documenting every detail of its condition and provenance. The 1941 Indian Sports Scout was remarkably well preserved. Despite 60 years in the sealed chamber, its mechanical components frozen in time, but largely intact. The maroon and cream paint, though dulled by decades of dust and the absence of light, still showed the distinctive styling that had made Indian motorcycles famous among American riders. The chrome accents were tarnished but not rusted, protected from moisture by the sealed environment that had also preserved the human remains. Registration documentation recovered from a compartment beneath the seat confirmed that the motorcycle had been titled to Anthony Michael Carbone in New York in 1949 and re-registered in Ohio in 1952. It was a direct physical link to the man who had owned it and the era in which he had lived. Forensic archaeologists studied the chamber's construction to determine how and when it had been built, using techniques developed for archaeological excavations and crime scene analysis. Their detailed examination concluded that the chamber had been created during a period of approximately 3 to 5 days, using materials and construction techniques consistent with 1963 practices. The brick walls had been built first, creating a rectangular pit approximately 12 feet long, 8 feet wide, and 4 feet deep, in an excavated section of the factory floor. The work had been done by experienced masons who knew how to match the existing brickwork's appearance, mortar composition, and bonding pattern precisely. Employment records from Cleveland Industrial Metalworks during October 1963 revealed that a small crew had been hired for basement maintenance and drainage improvement. During the week of October 20th through October 25th, beginning the day after Carbone was last seen alive. The crew consisted of 4 men, all with Italian surnames, all paid in cash rather than by check, all listing addresses that investigators in 2023 determined had never actually existed. The foreman listed for this crew was named Vincent Morelli, a name that appeared nowhere else in any records and could not be traced to any real person, living or dead. The crew had worked primarily during night shifts when the factory's regular workforce was absent, completing their grim work without any interaction with regular employees. The modern investigation revisited the question of motive with the benefit of 60 years of additional historical knowledge. FBI analysts, reviewing the original 1963 case files, identified details that had been overlooked or misinterpreted at the time. Wiretap transcripts from late 1963, collected as part of broader surveillance operations against the Cleveland family, contained oblique references to the Youngstown problem being solved, and no more worries about the motorcycle man. These references had not been connected to Carbone's disappearance by investigators in 1963, who had not fully understood how distinctive his Indian Scout motorcycle was or how it served as his calling card among associates. In retrospect, these intercepted comments strongly suggested that Carbone's murder had been sanctioned by Cleveland's own leadership. The emerging picture suggested that Anthony Carbone had become a liability that multiple parties wanted eliminated. He knew too much about the Cleveland family's operations in Youngstown and had become a focal point for both FBI surveillance and Pittsburgh pressure. John Scalish, despite his reputation for avoiding violence, had apparently concluded that Carbone's death was a necessary business decision. Eliminating him would solve multiple problems. It would remove a potential informant who might someday cooperate with federal investigators. It would appease Pittsburgh's demands for change in Youngstown, and it would send a clear message to other associates about the consequences of becoming too visible or too valuable to outside interests. The discovery of Carbone's remains in October 2023 allowed the Cuyahoga County coroner to officially change his death certificate from presumed deceased to homicide. The cause of death was listed as gunshot wounds to the head, with the manner of death classified as homicide by person or persons unknown. The date of death was estimated as October 19 or 1963, the night Carbone had left his Garfield Heights home for what his wife believed was a routine business meeting. After 6 decades in a sealed chamber beneath a factory floor, Anthony Michael Carbone's death was finally officially acknowledged, documented, and entered into the permanent record. The question of criminal prosecution was essentially moot given the passage of time. Any person who might have been involved in ordering or carrying out Carbone's murder in 1963 would be well over 100 years old, if still alive, and extensive research confirmed that none were. John Scalish had died in 1976. James Licavoli had died in 1985. Frank Brancato, who had served as underboss during the 1962, had died in 1973. The soldiers and associates who might have carried out the actual killing, constructed the chamber, and poured the concrete seal were similarly deceased. The Cleveland crime family itself had been reduced to a shadow of its former power by decades of prosecutions and defections. Justice, in any conventional legal sense, was impossible. Instead, the investigation focused on providing closure for Carbone's surviving family and documenting the truth for historical purposes. FBI agents met with Anthony Carbone Jr. and Lucia Carbone at the Cleveland field office to share what they had learned about their father's final hours. For Anthony Jr., now nearly 80 years old and retired from his accounting career, the meeting brought painful clarity to questions he had carried for 6 decades. He had been 8 years old when his father disappeared. Old enough to remember him clearly, but too young to understand what had happened. He had spent his entire adult life wondering, imagining various scenarios, never knowing the truth. Now, finally, he understood that his father had been executed by the very organization he had served loyally. The Indian Scout motorcycle presented investigators with a unique historical artifact and a delicate question of disposition. After being photographed, documented, and analyzed for every possible forensic detail, the question arose of what should happen to this tangible link to a murdered man and a vanished era. Anthony Carbone Jr. indicated that he had no interest in keeping the motorcycle. It represented a world and a life that he had deliberately rejected and left behind. Eventually, an agreement was reached to donate the Indian Scout to the Crawford Auto Aviation Museum in Cleveland, where it would be displayed along with documentation of its remarkable history. The museum agreed to present the motorcycle not as a glorification of organized crime, but as an artifact of Cleveland's complex and sometimes violent past. The sealed chamber itself was demolished along with the rest of the Cleveland Industrial Metalworks building in early 2024, its bricks and concrete reduced to rubble and carted away for disposal. The site was cleared. The soil was remediated according to environmental regulations, and the property became part of a larger redevelopment effort aimed at transforming Cleveland's abandoned industrial landscape into something new. By spring of 2024, nothing remained of the factory except photographs in historical archives and the memories of those who had worked there decades earlier. The spot where Anthony Carbone had lain undiscovered for 60 years was now empty ground, awaiting whatever new purpose the city would eventually find for it. Anthony Michael Carbone's remains were released to his family in December 2023, almost exactly 60 years after his death. A funeral mass was held at Holy Rosary Church in Cleveland's Little Italy, the same neighborhood where the men who had ordered his death had once gathered in social clubs to plan their operations. The mass was attended by approximately 30 people, including Carbone's 2 elderly children, several grandchildren and great-grandchildren he had never known existed, and a handful of aged Italian Americans who still remembered the old days when the Cleveland mob ruled Mayfield Road. The priest made no mention of Carbone's criminal activities in his homily, focusing instead on themes of forgiveness, redemption, and the peace that comes with finally knowing the truth. Following the Mass, Anthony Michael Carbone was buried at Holy Cross Cemetery in Brook Park, Ohio, in a plot near other members of the Italian-American community he had served and ultimately been betrayed by. His grave marker bears only his name, his dates of birth and death finally accurate, after 60 years, and the simple inscription, "Finally at rest." He was buried without his beloved Indian Scout motorcycle. Which now resides in a museum display case a few miles away. But in a sense, the motorcycle had served its final purpose. It had been the key to identifying him after 6 decades in darkness, and had provided crucial evidence about the circumstances and timing of his death. The Cleveland crime family gave up one more of its buried secrets in October 2023, another chapter in the long and bloody history of organized crime in America's industrial heartland. For 60 years, Anthony Michael Carbone had lain beneath the concrete floor of a factory that had itself become a relic of a vanished industrial era. His killers had believed they were creating a tomb that would never be found, a secret that would die with everyone who knew it existed. They nearly succeeded. But cities change, buildings fall, and the past has a way of resurfacing when least expected, demanding to be acknowledged and accounted for. The demolition crew that broke through that concrete seal on October 16, 2023 was not looking for bodies or motorcycles or long-buried organized crime victims. They were simply doing their job, clearing away the remnants of Cleveland's industrial past to make way for whatever future might come. What they found instead was a mystery that had haunted one family for 6 decades, and a truth that the Cleveland mob had tried to bury forever. Some secrets, it seems, refuse to stay buried. Some truths demand to be told, no matter how long they have been hidden in darkness. Rest in peace, Anthony Carbone. Your long wait is finally over. Your children finally know what happened to the father who kissed them goodnight, walked out into an October evening, and never came home. And you are finally where you should have been laid to rest 6 decades ago, not in a sealed chamber, beside your beloved motorcycle, but in consecrated ground, surrounded by family, beneath the Ohio sky you once rode through on Sunday mornings. The Indian Scout that carried you through your final years is preserved now in a museum, a testament to a bygone era of American manufacturing and American organized crime. Both are part of history now. Both, at long last, are finally at peace.